Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted tonight to be with Maarten Boudry. I hope I said that right.
That was absolutely perfect.
Nice.
Boudry.
Good to hear. I normally butcher these things. So, for those of you who are new to what Maarten has been up to for the last couple of years, he is a Belgian philosopher and skeptic. He's been a research member of the Department of Philosophy and Moral Sciences at Ghent University since 2006. He also, let me get this right, you were the chair of the Department of Philosophy,
It
or was it?
was it was a chair of critical thinking of the whole university. It was not really of the department, but it was named after a famous in Belgium philosopher, Etienne Vermeers, who is also an atheist and a skeptic and a moral philosopher who died 5 years ago. So the chair was established in his honor, and I was the first chairholder. The chair itself has been abolished now. Unfortunately, I was supposed to have a successor, but because of budget cuts, they got rid of the chair. Too bad. But so forever, I will remain the first and only chairholder of the Etienne Vermeers Chair of Critical Thinking.
Unique title. And Maarten has published dozens of articles in philosophy, in various philosophy of science. His research interests are irrationality, pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, cultural evolution, nature of belief, that line of topics. And he has a fantastic TED talk as well for those of you who are into TED. I'm really into TED. I love, I just always have some sort of, I can just play in the background and listen to it. So, Maarten, I've brought you on to discuss your paper alongside some collaborators, How Not to Attack Intelligent Design Creationism, Philosophical Misconceptions About Methodological Naturalism. So, to get the conversation going, I think the first thing I guess I can ask you is, what was your motivation to, tackle this topic?
Yeah, this is a bit of a trip down memory lane because the paper was published in 2010. I'm not sure if I had submitted it elsewhere before, so I probably wrote it around 29, which is exactly 15 years ago. But I think I had a change of mind, as I recall. I had been reading up on the whole debate about the Kitzmiller versus Dover process. This is something that many people will recall about the equal treatment of evolutionary theory on the one hand and intelligent design creationism, which is kind of a repackaging of the old creationism in classrooms. And one of the arguments that was put forward by people like Barbara Forrest, by Michael Roos, but also some major scientific organizations like the National Academy of Science and what is it called? The National Society for Science Education. That was then headed by Eugenie Scott.
Yep.
They put forward this philosophical argument that became known as methodological naturalism. And so this is the idea that science, almost by definition or because of some fundamental reason, cannot evaluate supernatural claims. Now, if this is true, of course, intelligent design creationism, which is a supernatural or religious hypothesis, it's kind of a non-starter. So you can basically just rule it out just by default. And according to that definition, it doesn't really have any place in the classroom. If you're only going to, teach students scientific theories, and then because of some philosophical principle, you can rule out any supernatural hypothesis or supernatural theory, then intelligent design creationism is just can just be dismissed out of hand. And I used to believe that because of some of the reasons that I discuss in the paper, that supernatural explanations are just unfalsifiable, untestable, that there's no way to evaluate them, and it doesn't make any sense, or perhaps the very definition of supernatural is perhaps incoherent. But then I started to have some nagging doubts about actually what I was doing when I was involved in the skeptics movement. The skeptics are people who are interested in pseudoscience, in the paranormal, in all sorts of weird claims, but also supernatural claims. And again, I mean, we can have a whole discussion about what's the overlap between paranormal phenomena and supernatural phenomena. These are kind of pointers. We don't really have very crisp definitions of what natural versus supernatural is or what paranormal is. But I mean, at least to a first approximation, some of these skeptics seem to be evaluating supernatural claims, and then, of course, rejecting them, because they argue that there's no evidence in favor of them. And one of the things, and that was also around, that was a 2006 paper, I think, by Benson et al., if I recall. And this was a famous paper in a medical journal, like a prestigious medical journal, about the efficacy of intercessory prayer. So what they really did is like a randomized clinical trial where they just divided people into two groups. One was the experimental group, and these people were being prayed for by some designated religious believers that were asked to pray for people, and they gave them their names, etc. And then there was a control group that was giving some other treatments or some sort of placebo treatment, or they were not being prayed for. And of course, the idea was to investigate if there had been any effect, if the people that had been prayed for were getting better at a statistically significant rate. And it turned out, of course, that there was no effect, etc. But then I started to wonder, if you can evaluate supernatural claims like that, if you can even publish it in scientific journals, it doesn't really make any sense that science, by definition, cannot evaluate the supernatural. I mean, here it is actually really happening. And there's dozens of examples of that from the skeptic movement. And so then the whole thing started to unravel for me, and eventually my new view that I defended in that paper together with two colleagues of mine back then at the University of Ghent was something that we called provisory methodological naturalism back then. I'm not sure if I would still use that term. I mean, we were still trying to conservatively hold on to the term methodological naturalism, but we were making a distinction between intrinsic methodological naturalism and provisory or pragmatic methodological naturalism. So basically, the intrinsic MN, I'm just going to call it MN for brevity's sake. That's the idea that I just outlined, that by definition, science is unable to evaluate supernatural claims. So it's just illegitimate to bring something like intelligent design in the classroom. So science neither rejects it nor confirms it. It is strictly neutral on the supernatural. And the position that we defended was basically, sure, at this point in time, scientists do not really take supernatural explanations seriously. But that's just because of their failed track record. It's not because there is some sort of intrinsic inability on the part of science to evaluate supernatural claims. And the history of science, I think actually there have been many attempts to establish supernatural claims. If you go back to the period before Darwin, William Paley, for example, the whole tradition of natural theology was basically proposing a supernatural hypothesis for the adaptive complexity in life, which was later on replaced by Darwin. And so in this paper, we defend the view that science does actually have the ability to evaluate supernatural claims to the extent that there's an appearance of just a complete absence of the supernatural in textbooks, for example. I mean, if you read a biology or a chemistry textbook, you're not going to find anything about God or about ghosts and demons, etc. That's not because science is unable to evaluate those claims. It's just that these claims have been dismissed. I mean, because over time, they just have failed over and over again. And at some point, I mean, you're not going to be taken seriously in a biological lab if you're observing some weird or anomalous result and you say, oh, the fairies must have interfered with it or something like that. So that was basically the argument that we were developing in that paper. And it was, I still remember that at one point I believed I was basically buying the philosophical consensus, which is something that many people like Michael Ruse and Barbara Forrest, the late Michael Ruse now, still believed. But I had a change of mind, and ever since I think I stuck to my guns. So I still believe what I wrote back in 2010.
Okay, nice. That's a really nice introduction into the topic. And one of the things that you do quite lucidly, and I really enjoyed the paper, is that you outline 5 arguments that were put together for this intrinsic view that there's something intrinsic about science which weds it to methodological naturalism in a way that it can't disconfirm supernatural claims. So the 5 arguments that you essentially debunk and unravel are the argument from the definition of science, the argument from lawful regularity, the science stopper argument, the argument from procedural necessity, and the testability argument. So I think it'll be good if we go through each one of them briefly, and then we could then get into some other issues. So the argument from the definition of science, let's get into that first. Why did you, I mean, what is this argument for intrinsic methodological naturalism? Why does it fail?
Well, the definition of science is a topic that I actually wrote much more on later on in my career. I became interested in the demarcation problem in philosophy, so how to define science, how to distinguish it from pseudoscience, and also how to distinguish it from other forms of knowing. I would actually argue now, I'm not sure if that I already developed that argument in the paper, that we don't really have a very clearly delineated and crisp definition of science, because I think science blends into humanities. For example, in certain languages, the humanities are treated as part of science, like in German. The term Wissenschaften is more expansive and encompassing than the term sciences in English, for example. And so in general, I'm a little bit skeptical of people who claim to have an understanding of the scientific methods as something that is unique to science and doesn't occur anywhere else. I think as a naturalist, as someone who believes that science evolved out of just the natural capacities of the human mind, I don't think that there's anything that science does that is a radical break from what went before. Science is just taking advantage of certain capacities that we have, and many of the logical forms of inference, of the gathering of evidence, even mathematics and statistical procedures do have some precedence even in ordinary knowledge. But specifically, when you talk about the definition of science in the context of methodological naturalism, of course, there the idea is that science is by definition only dealing with natural causes and explanation, and the supernatural falls out of its purview. I think, if I recall, this was the argument that was brought forward by people like Michael Roos and also Robert Pennock at the Kitzmer versus Dover trial. So they came up with some sort of definition of science. And I think actually it was a little bit misleading, because, I mean, they were presenting it as some sort of philosophical consensus that there's this definition of science, but actually we don't really have that consensus, not any definition of science. I mean, philosophers hardly agree on anything. But I think specifically what makes this, what makes it problematic to cash out the definition of science in terms of natural and supernatural is that the term natural is a very slippery one that has been shifting over time. Natural, of course, is always opposed to something else, something extra natural, something supernatural. But at least up until very recently, we didn't really have a very good conception of what is the natural. I mean, and even now, some people are physicalists, for example, and I mean, is physicalism the same as naturalism? Some people thought that electricity 200 years ago was a supernatural phenomenon because it was kind of, it was invisible, it was spooky, and it had something to do with the force of life. And I mean, it had all sorts of weird effects. Now we would no longer call it supernatural. The same, you can ask the same question about parapsychology, like telekinesis. Is that supernatural? Well, it depends. I mean, I don't really believe in it, but if it were to exist, and if it was just a force of nature, if there was some sort of physical mechanism that we could use to communicate at a distance, well, I mean, would it be natural or supernatural? I'm not sure about it. So I don't really believe that there's a very good definition of the natural in the first place, and I think for that very reason, it's a very shaky conceptual ground to use as a foundation for your definition of science, and so that's why I think if you don't have a very good understanding of what it means to be supernatural, I mean, what does it even mean to say that you're excluding the supernatural from science by definition. And I think, if I recall, later in the paper, we actually make clear that to some extent, these defenders of intrinsic methodological naturalism are also contradicting themselves, because they come up with a definition of the supernatural, which would actually, according to which something like intelligent design creationism would actually be natural. It would no longer be supernatural, because their idea, I mean, according to their understanding of what it is to be natural, the moments that you try to investigate something scientifically, and you bring it, like you try to investigate, like, for example, you publish something in a medical journal, you try to investigate if God is answering our prayers, etc., then by definition it becomes natural. Okay, that but if we follow the lines of that definition, then the definition kind of defeats the purpose, because it no longer serves the purpose of ruling out intelligent design creations from the classroom, because you have just decided that by the very act of trying to investigating it scientifically, they have rendered the supernatural natural. So all these complications, for all of these complications related to the definition of natural versus supernatural, I think it's a very bad idea to define science in terms of the natural. It's only very recently, perhaps with the rise of modern physics, and even now, I think we don't really have an agreed upon definition of what is natural, or exactly what it would mean to discover something that is supernatural. I can give you my definition, but it's a kind of rough and ready definition. That is probably the best that we can muster in a conceptual quagmire like this one.
Okay, that's a really comprehensive way of addressing the issue, and I just want to go off on a slight tangent, if you allow me. There's been a lot of criticisms of, Rupert Sheldrake's ideas on the extended mind, morphic resonance, and all of that. I mean, if I was to adopt your way of looking at things and then criticize his perspective, I wouldn't go down the line of saying, well, it's pseudoscience. I would just say it's just, perhaps bad science. So that seems to be what you're sort of pointing out, that it's just better to, not try and rule out certain ideas by saying, well, they're just not science. It's better to sort of let it flow. And then show.
Absolutely, yes. It's better that it flow. I do think it's wrong-headed to try to rule out something by definition without even being willing to investigate the claims. That kind of shortcut, whether it's based on the natural or supernatural, or whether it's some people say that history is not a science because it's not repeatable. Like you cannot perform an experiment. That's a very narrow-minded way of thinking. I do think, having said that the concept of pseudoscience is a useful one. Although, again, I don't really have like a small set of necessary and sufficient conditions for pseudoscience, and neither do I have one for science. My view of pseudoscience is actually that there are many ways for a theory to go wrong, but there are only a comparatively fewer number of ways to create a deceptive appearance of scientificity. I'm not sure if that way of defining it is already clear enough, but what I'm basically saying is that every pseudoscience, or every theory that fails, that doesn't have the evidence on its side, has to come up with a way to deflect that, to protect itself against criticism, to protect itself against counter evidence. And I think you can see some recurring patterns in the theories that are that we now call pseudosciences, like astrology or intelligent design creationism. They tend to resort to similar mechanisms, and I think that's an interesting diagnostic criterion of pseudoscience. But that's very a posteriori. That's not. I'm not saying that parapsychology is a pseudoscience. Because it's dealing with something spooky, and because they don't have a physical explanation. Or I'm not trying to find a shortcut and say, like, I'm not even gonna evaluate those claims. For one thing, also because a lot of times when we were investigating something in the history of science, we didn't have any understanding of the causal mechanisms. When people started investigating electricity or magnetism, or even the mechanism of inheritance, they had no clue at all about what was the underlying phenomenon. So you have to have I think a broad and open definition of science that doesn't commit you to saying that scientific theories need to involve certain types of causes or certain types of mechanisms or certain types of material phenomena. Because, I mean, if you apply that definition to the history of science, you're going to be forced to rule out a lot of stuff. That would be very weird to say, for example, that Darwin's evolutionary theory was not scientific because he didn't understand anything about inheritance and he had no clue about DNA. I mean, okay, you can say that, but that's a very weird definition of science.
Yeah, it's too restrictive. And for anyone who wants to look into this a bit further, there's a fantastic book by Maarten and Massimo Piglucci, Philosophy of...
Good friend of mine and a collaborator as well. A great guy.
Yeah, he is. And I in fact interviewed him on your other book with him, Science Unlimited.
Yes, that's a couple of years later, and that was on also the definition of science. But there we don't really look at science versus pseudoscience, but we look at what I call territorial demarcation, which is science versus other ways of knowing that might also be legitimate in their own right. Interestingly, I have a long-running discussion with Massimo on exactly this issue of methodological naturalism, because I think after all these years, I still haven't managed to convince him that that the old philosophical consensus is wrong. Although I don't know, I haven't checked recently. Perhaps he changed his mind. But so he's one of those people who is more on the side of Robert Pennock, Michael Roos, and these and national scientific organizations.
Yeah, and also
so what we call intrinsic methodological nationalism.
Yeah, I mean, famous for this view from a biological standpoint was Stephen Jay Gould, right? So with his NOMA. So the second argument for intrinsic methodological naturalism that you debunk is the argument from lawful regularity. Let's get into that one.
Yeah, I think if I recall, the idea there is that people also, again, have a sort of restrictive definition of science, which says that science only deals with what is lawful and regular, where you can, find some pattern. If something is completely random, if there's no rhyme or reason, if it just happens, in a completely fortuitous way, then there's no way to investigate it because you cannot repeat it, you cannot control it, etc. So that's why science can only deal with regular and observable things. And according to their perspective, the supernatural is by definition not lawful and regular. It's something that is, especially if it's done by an omnipotent God. God can basically do anything that he wants at any time, so there's no way to investigate God. If I recall, that was the argument. It's been a while since I read this. Is that correct? You have probably read it.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, you got the crux of it. It's kind of funny. I'm reminding you of what you wrote. But there's a quote in the paper that you give, and I thought this was quite relevant for driving this point home. So this is from Richard Lewontin. Either the world of phenomena is a consequence of the regular operation of repeatable causes and their repeatable effects, operating roughly along the lines of known physical law, or else at every instant, all physical regularities may be ruptured and a totally unforeseeable set of events may occur. We cannot live simultaneously in a world of natural causation and of miracles, for if one miracle can occur, there is no limit.
Yeah, that's what we philosophers would call a false dilemma. I think he sets up a very stark contrast, and I think the contrast is informed by a very theologically narrow understanding of omnipotence in the Christian tradition. If you have a God that is indeed literally omnipotent and is also capable of doing anything at all, then indeed, yes, there's no way to tell God when to stop. If he can break or violate the laws of nature, at one instance, he can do it at any time. But that is not necessarily the case. I mean, it's not. there are ways to imagine supernatural creatures or supernatural causes that have a more restricted application. So I don't really believe that once we allow one miracle, for example, once we so, for example, if we investigate the efficacy of prayer and it turns out that prayer actually works, but only under specific conditions, only if it's done by a Catholic priest, for example, only if you perform a certain ritual, etc., that becomes lawful and regular then. Because if you're going to try to do a Muslim, if you try to make an imam heal someone miraculously, then it wouldn't work because you're not addressing the right God, etc. So even within the domain of the supernatural, I can come up with, I mean, you can say these are all fanciful scenarios, but this is absolutely possible. There might be some supernatural intervention, whether it's by God or by other supernatural creatures, that is predictable. That is not just all bets are off and now anything can happen at any time. And even if that were the case, I mean, even if it were the case that God could completely basically destroy the scientific enterprise because he can screw everything up if he wanted to, that doesn't mean that it's not true, of course. I mean, it's also the way that Maarten is phrasing it is almost that he's fearful of this hypothesis. Like, what if we allow one miracle, then like suddenly like the ground will be swept away from under our feet, and then the whole of the scientific enterprise will be destroyed. But I mean, this is something that we have to find out. I don't think this is the case, but it is logically possible at least. I mean, imagine that. That we live in some sort of a computer simulation, or that God actually exists, and up until now, God has allowed the natural course of affairs like to unfold according to certain regularities, but He decides to suspend that tomorrow for whatever reason, like it's the end of days, or the computer designer just decides to switch off the simulation, and we all die, or just like there are glitches in the Matrix. I mean, this is the movie The Matrix that I'm referring to, of course. All of that is possible. It's only, of course, I can understand if we lived in a universe where there was absolutely no regularity at all, no laws of nature, there was no rhyme or reason. Yeah, then I think it's probably true that science would not be possible. But then again, our mere existence wouldn't be possible. Nothing would be possible. It would be utter and complete chaos. So the mere fact that we exist already shows that there's some regularity. But within that regularity, we can spot some anomalies. We can spot weird events. And I mean, to be even in our actual modern science, is something like quantum mechanics. I mean, I'm not an expert in quantum physics at all, but there is an element of randomness there. There is an element of stuff just happening without any sort of underlying explanation, just pure, not epistemic randomness, but like really ontological randomness. At least that's what seems to be happening. That hasn't destroyed science. I mean, that's something that we just investigate. If it turns out that some things just happen completely unpredictably, then that is also amenable. That is also susceptible to scientific investigation. So so there are two responses. To summarize that, it's a false dilemma. I don't think that if you allow one miracle, that the whole of the of science will unravel. And even if that were the case, that's we would just have to suck it up, I guess. That would be too bad for science. That certain things would just be impossible to investigate. It's just in the same way that, I mean, there's certain areas of certain regions of the universe that are just too far removed from us, and that were just completely epistemically inaccessible to us. Well, yeah, that's just too bad for science. There are certain things that we will never know. But we can also investigate that to see. And actually, I wrote a paper about that later on with a neurologist, Jan Fishman, where we're basically making the argument everything is a posteriori in science. So this whole idea that lawful regularity needs to be established at first as a sort of precondition for doing science is kind of putting the cart before the horse. It's something that we discovered as we went along. Like, hey, wait a minute. I mean, when we put a ball like on an inclined plane and it slides down, it seems to happen in a kind of regular fashion, and we can apply mathematics to it. And some other things, of course, are much more complicated, and it's very hard to mathematically describe them. All of that is up for grabs. It's something that we discovered all along, and it could have been different. It's not. It's very misleading to just at the very end, or now that the science is established, to pretend that this lawful regularity was something that we started from. No, it's something that we ended up with. It's something that we investigated and that we confirmed over and over again, that there are regularities, I mean, in different ways and in different to different extents. But again, it's not some sort of assumption that we started from. It's a finding.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good way of putting it. And the next one I wanted to speak about is the argument from it being a science stopper. So who you quote here is Robert Pennock, and he takes this argument basically back to Francis Bacon. So what he says is, if one were to find some phenomena that appeared inexplicable according to some current theory, one might be tempted to attribute it to the direct intervention of God, but a methodological principle that rules out appeal to supernatural powers prods one to look further for a natural explanation.
Yeah. Sorry, so I'm going to interrupt you for 1 minute. I think it's better that I'm just going to briefly look at what I wrote, because I kind of I don't have a perfect memory, so that I kind of have an understanding. So let me just briefly, and then you can cut that out. Is that okay?
I mean, we're live at the moment, but I can sort of summarize.
Oh, this is live streamed. I didn't realize that. It's good that you tell me. No, I thought it was recorded and going to be released later. No, but then it's fine. I'm just a little bit worried that I might be misrepresenting what I wrote initially, because it's been a while. No, but let's just.
No, that's fine. I mean, I don't think there'll be a problem with you misquoting yourself.
Well, actually, yeah. In case I contradict myself, I am large. I contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman once said. I contradict myself.
I mean, what's nice about this is you wrote this 15 years ago, so it'd be nice to see how your thoughts have evolved and adapted.
That is true. Yeah, I don't have to exactly echo what I wrote 15 years ago, but it's so. Again, I don't really think that the idea that science is that the supernatural is a science stopper would apply to any sort of supernatural explanation. It is true, of course, that if you look at the history of science, oftentimes what has happened is that people investigate some phenomenon, and when they are really becoming desperate, when they can't find any natural explanation for what's happening, they're basically just throwing their hands up in the air and say, well, I guess God did it, or whatever. It's going to be a mystery and we're never going to find out. Okay, that is indeed how some religious believers or some scientists have behaved in the past. And in that sense, it has indeed been a sort of science stopper. And then it's just like, okay, we call it quits, God did it, and we don't have to investigate it anymore. But again, I can come up with counterfactual scenarios of supernatural hypotheses that are actually productive. That be like, okay, like again, that example that I described with prayer. Suppose that we find out that it only works with a Catholic priest. Okay, so can we narrow it down? Like, if it only does it only work in certain contexts? Can we heighten or strengthen the effect by, for example, having several people pray for a single patient at the same time? So there's all sorts of productive hypotheses that you could come up with. Of course, we never had to deal with a situation like that, because up until now, supernatural hypotheses have always failed. But I think what many of these philosophers are doing is that they're taking the actual failures of supernatural explanations that we have observed in the history of science within a certain sociological and cultural context, and kind of take them to be representative of like a general failure of anything that has to do with the supernatural. But that's not at all the case. It's if parapsychology, for example, I'm not sure if parapsychology is supernatural, but parapsychologists often engage in evasive behavior, and they can't really come up with a good definition of what telekinesis is. But that's only because they don't have good experimental evidence. If they were really, like, if there was really a signal in the noise and they could come up, then of course they would have a productive and progressive research program, and they would come up with more sophisticated hypotheses, different ways of parsing the phenomenon, different ways of investigating it. It's just that unfortunately for them, they find themselves in a world where they basically have to, just pull it out of thin air. Because, I mean, as far as we know, there is no psi force, there is no paranormal telekinesis or telepathy. And then, of course, you will end up inevitably with a degenerating research program. But here, if we're talking about the definition of science and methodological naturalism, we're not talking about science as we have actually observed it in the world, but that it just of science in general. And if these people want to make the argument that science by definition cannot evaluate supernatural claims, even if God were to exist, even if telepathy were to exist, then they have to do better than to always point to just some actual failures in the history of science. And that's why I like to come up with these counterfactual scenarios to really push, like, to pump the intuition that there are certain circumstances or conditions in which supernatural explanations would not only be susceptible to scientific investigation, but I, as a skeptic, as an atheist, I can come up with, like, scenarios where I would be convinced almost overnight that truly God must exist. Because if the evidence is overwhelming enough, and if I have ruled out all the other natural explanations, and if we did just enough scientific experiments, then sure enough, I would be convinced, or I would be persuaded as a skeptic, and I would convert to whatever religion turns out to be true.
Absolutely. Okay, so a related argument is the procedural necessity one. So, I want to read out a quote here from Barbara Forrest. Methodological naturalism does exclude the supernatural as an explanatory principle because it is unknowable by means of scientific inquiry. So it kind of overlaps with what you've already said.
Yeah, it's a bit, I mean, I think I remember considering, should we make this into a separate argument, but because it is indeed overlapping, and it's something that only Barbara Forrest develops, this idea of procedural necessity. But again, that's what does she say exactly? Because I'm looking at the paper myself now. Why would the metaphysical naturalists appeal to the lack of explanatory success of the supernatural, as Forrest does, if that success were procedurally impossible? Yeah, she's kind of contradicting herself with that, because on the one hand, as I do, she invokes the failure of supernatural explanations in the past, just a failed track record. But on the other hand, she says that it is procedurally impossible for supernatural explanations to succeed. But then it's not really a genuine failure if there was not even a possibility to succeed. So if she admits of the possibility of success, then she admits that supernatural explanations can be susceptible to scientific investigation. So again, I think these people are only narrowly focusing on the kind of supernatural, bullshit, not to put too fine a point on it, that they are familiar with, that they are dealing with in the courtroom. But there's nothing about the supernatural per se that falls outside of the purview of science by definition. So I think this argument by Barbara Forrest is indeed in line with the previous argument about it being a science stopper and about lawful regularity.
Yeah. So we've covered that sufficiently. And the last one, interestingly, you quote your
Massimo. Yeah.
Yeah, Massimo, and in terms of methodological naturalism and testability. So you quote him saying, science rejects the possibility of supernatural explanations not as a matter of principle, but of methodology. What kind of research would one do? What kind of methodology would one use? If the premise were that God can do whatever he pleases whenever he wishes to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this and again, I have already mentioned the example of intercessory prayer. Even if we were to assume, for the sake of the argument, that God could do anything he wants, he could suspend the laws of nature at any time. He could destroy the universe at this very second, and our conversation would stop. That doesn't mean that he will. I mean, there might be some regularity in what God decides to do. Up until now, I mean, at least, again, assuming that God exists, he has allowed the universe to unfold more or less according to natural laws, perhaps with a few exceptions. Some people believe that Jesus rose from the dead, so that would be a supernatural miracle that was performed by God. Most of these Christians believe that if God wanted to, he could have resurrected anyone. I mean, it's just he's omnipotent. He could do whatever he wants. So yes, Massimo is right. And again, he's like thinking about this in terms of the Christian God that he grew up with. I mean, he's Italian, so yeah, he's familiar with the same Catholic God that I'm familiar with. And according to Orthodox theology, God is indeed omnipotent, so he could do anything that he wants. But that doesn't mean that he will. I mean, unless he's deliberately trying to sabotage us, unless he's just whatever, just all over the place because he wants to confuse us or something. But that obviously we're not living in that kind of a universe. So if God only decides to perform miracles once in a while, he might have his reasons for doing so, and reasons just just as we, we're all natural scientists in the way that we're trying to figure out what other people think, and we're trying to define their intentions and their beliefs, etc. There is a regularity in their behavior that we can understand, as a function of their intentions and their beliefs. And the same applies to God. If God decides to strike down the wicked, for example, then there's a regularity there, because he's only going to strike down the wicked and not the good people. See, even though he could strike down the good people, there is a lawful regularity in there that you could investigate. And the same applies to, I think, to any kind of supernatural hypothesis. It's only a very special kind of supernatural hypothesis that is completely arbitrary, that is completely unlawful, no regularity to be found at all. Yes, I guess an explanation like that, that would be very hard. I'm trying to think of, I'm reading the Three-Body Problem now, the Cixin Liu science fiction novel. And there you have the idea that the aliens or the extraterrestrials are sabotaging scientific experiments because they don't want scientific progress to continue, because they plan to invade our planet, and it takes 400 years for them to get to travel very close to the speed of light. And so they're afraid that if they give us like 400 more years for science, and science can flourish, etc., that we're going to build up some defensive capacity. And that's why they're sending some sort of is it supernatural? I don't know, like some very fancy photon. Or have you read the book?
No. I was actually watching the
Netflix series. Yeah. It's called Sophon, I think. So it's a sort of an elementary particle that can travel at the speed of light, or even instantaneously, I think, and that can literally like mess up just the experiments within the Large Hadron Collider at the CERN. So if the extraterrestrial, or if the supernatural creature has an incentive or an intention to deceive us and to sabotage our scientific experiment and to make everything as unpredictable and as random as possible, then I guess we're screwed. I mean, assuming that we're just puny and limited and we don't know what is going on, and then I guess we just have to give up. Although even in that scenario, actually, humanity resists, and eventually I haven't finished the whole trilogy yet, but and also I don't want to spoil it for everyone, but at least there is an actual battle to be fought between humanity and the extraterrestrials. So we have to think carefully about these examples. It's I keep thinking that many of these people are just they have a kind of a very superficial understanding of, if God could interfere with your microscope, then all bets are off, and there's no, it's possible to do any science. But I whenever I hear an argument like that, I'm like, hold on, let's think this through. If God decides to do that, why does he do it? Why does he do it there? Why hasn't he done it before? Why do we live in a lawful, regular universe? Perhaps he might even cooperate. Perhaps he's just like giving us some tantalizing clues because he wants us to know about him, and he wants to reveal himself. I mean, there's so many different ways in which we could potentially know something about God, depending on his intentions and his power,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Now, just to bring all of this back to where it began, the Dover versus Kitzmiller trial. So, say we're in this scenario, and I'm just going to give
Mm-hmm.
you something about my background, which I want to put myself in that scenario and put yourself there to just come up with a question for you. So, I used to believe intelligent design was not science because of the definition of science.
Yeah.
Later on, I actually started doubting that position, and then I just shifted over to intelligent design is science. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm sitting there in the courtroom 20 whatever years ago, and we were to, see this trial and have the verdict that we actually did, I would be quite deflated, right? Oh,
Mm-hmm.
Musa said this, and therefore. But then, if we were to transport yourself in place of Roos, and you were to make the arguments that you've made now, you would have elevated intelligent design from pseudoscience to bad science, and that would have made me feel better.
Well, I think also you might have had. I mean, at least even if at the end of the day I end up rejecting intelligent design, I have at least given it a fair hearing. I haven't dismissed it from the outset, and I think one of the ways in which the reasoning behind the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial has backfired and has sort of provided grist to the mill of intelligent design creationism, which was the title of my next paper, is that you're making science look dogmatic and
Yes.
prejudiced. You're coming across as people who are just having blinders on. And it's like we're only going to look at natural things, even if we allow, especially if you say, as of course Barbara Forrest and Robert Pennock and many of these people were arguing, they wanted to avoid a conflict with religion. So they didn't want to say that science was atheistic or materialist or whatever. And they say, oh, it's perfectly possible that God exists. And it's perfectly possible that God intervenes in our world. And like all these supernatural hypotheses are true. It's just that as scientists, we're just going to refrain from looking into it. Like we don't like, no, we're not going to look there. Whatever happens in a microscope, and we're not interested in it. So we're going to keep you out of the classroom because we have a certain definition of science. That's actually saying, it's almost saying like, even if it were true, we're just going to ignore you because we're just too dogmatic or too narrow-minded, and we're not really interested in finding out the truth. We're only interested in our definition of science and keeping up with science as we conceive it. And of course, there are plenty of intelligent design creationists like Dembski, like Behe, who have accused scientists and philosophers of a kind of dogmatism of being just prejudiced against anything that smacks of the supernatural. And I think, I mean, to be honest, with some justification. I don't want to claim that scientists are dogmatic, because I do see the kind of the rationality of the political situation that these people found themselves in, especially like somebody like Eugenie Scott or what's his name from the National Academy of Science, who's an evangelical Christian. Sorry, Francis Collins. Yes, exactly. Of course, they want to find some sort of political truce. Like they want to say that science and religion do not necessarily have to be in conflict. And one way of doing that is, like Stephen Jay Gould was doing, although he was doing it in a slightly different way, is just separating the two domains and saying, like, science has on the one side and then religion on the other side, and they don't need to interact because they're just dealing with different things. Science is only dealing with the natural, religion is only dealing with the supernatural, and there's no way for them to for the twain to ever meet. And I see the political rationality behind that, but I think it was just a little bit disingenuous, and it was mercilessly pointed out by intelligent design creationists that actually this logic or this whole justification of methodological naturalism doesn't really make any sense. So the way I was, I mean, if I were in that courtroom, I would probably also have to think about these political issues, of course. And then, as a
Yeah.
philosopher, I mean, this is what my TED talk was about. Like, the truth is always better. Like, even if it's politically inconvenient to say something that is untrue, I still prefer the truth. I still prefer to say that, okay, I'm sorry, but the supernatural explanations are scientifically valid. Like, you can investigate them. But then, of course, I mean, the flip side of that coin is that, but then we don't find any evidence. Sorry. So there is indeed a conflict, in my view, between science and religion. But I think the reason why some intelligent design people were sympathetic to my argument, I mean, I got some very friendly emails from some of these people. I can kind of see, because I was taking them more seriously. For example, by the way, I was not the only one. Someone like Tanner A.T.'s and Jerry Coyne are also critical of methodological naturalism. They also believe that the supernatural falls within the purview of science. Richard Dawkins, to some extent, has also, I mean, he has called God a hypothesis about the universe. So he would also, he would also believe that it's impossible to scientifically investigate supernatural claims. And I think in my experience, and even if you end up dismissing intelligent design creationism because of lack of evidence, or because you just don't think the arguments are convincing enough, or specific arguments about irreducible complexity, I think these people at least feel that they got a fair shot, and we at least have had a debate, and you can argue about the value of irreducible complexity or not, but it sounds like more fair in a way than just to say, oh, no, you're dealing with something supernatural, so no, just get out. You don't have any place here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm trying to, if I was in the courtroom and then you were giving the testimony instead of Roos, and you put the argument this way, I can also see that from one perspective, I may feel elated that, oh, look, at least it's not pseudoscience. But then from another perspective, I could see across the courtroom a Darwinist who does not want to give creationism an inch, say, well, actually this is a stronger argument against you guys, because the argument Maarten's making is actually that the entire history of science shows that naturalism works over supernaturalism. So it's not just to do with I think the way you put it in the paper is it's better to empirically argue than try and rule out a discussion by philosophical fiat.
Yes. In a way, you're right. And I mean, eventually, of course, I think it is more devastating to say you had a fair chance. Like, we did investigate it seriously. We considered it. It was not ruled out at the outset. You were not given an unfair disadvantage, and you still failed. So in that sense, I think you might be more deflated or discouraged when you hear an argument like that. But I still think, at least, that you have taken the theory more seriously than just dismissing it out of hand. If you dismiss it out of hand, I think somebody like Michael B., he probably believes, and William Dembski, that if only they had given the chance, like, to present their arguments, which they were not allowed to do because they were just unfairly ruled out, then they could have won. And I think if you really want to defeat your opponent, you have to allow him in the boxing ring. And okay, I'm not really phrasing it in very competitive or warlike terms now, but but science is basically, I mean, it's a competition between different theories and hypotheses. So I'm actually, I mean, it's been a while since I wrote about this, and also the Kismet versus Dover trial is a long time ago. It seems that this discussion has kind of winded down a little bit. I don't really hear a lot about intelligent design anymore. So I wonder what the state of the, like, they once had a very ambitious plan as well, like with their what's it called, the wedge document, and they wanted to, I mean, that seems to have failed. Are there still court cases, for example, or these people?
I would say there's like these parallel structures where you have the Discovery Institute, putting out publications, putting out podcasts, putting out their narratives. You had Stephen Meyer, on the Piers Morgan show. which is a very popular show here in the UK. He was on the Joe Rogan show, right? More than once. So I'm saying from a popular point of view, intelligent
Yeah.
design is probably more popular now than it was back then. And I think the discussions in terms of the courtroom are definitely gone. There's nobody arguing from that perspective. And also, I would also say some of the arguments have evolved. So we're starting to now see, intelligent design proponents sort of not wed themselves necessarily to irreducible complexity. They'll sort of argue within a natural sort of process and talk about how mutations are guided. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's moved on, but it hasn't died down, I would say.
Yeah, that's and I mean another interesting like demarcation problem in that discussion is back in the days during the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, intelligent design was really about like God intervening at a specific point in history, for example, to bring about human consciousness or the bacterial flagellum, for example, and that was treated as illegitimate or pseudoscientific because it was a supernatural hypothesis, etc. But then, on the other hand, if you look at someone like Francis Collins, if I recall, I mean, it's been a while, but there's a number of these theistic evolutionists. Also, somebody, what was his name again?
David Miller.
David Miller, exactly. So some of these theologians as well, who believed that even though evolution by natural selection unfolded according to just the laws of nature, that God had brought about specific mutations in the history of life by making very subtle use of quantum mechanic effects in a way that he was not really violating the laws of nature, because quantum mechanics again allows for some sort of randomness. Therefore, ensuring that eventually, because of course, from the religious point of view, humanity has a special place in history. There is a special relationship between God and humanity. So eventually, evolution had to culminate in humans, and then of course they have to present some sort of argument that to the effect that evolution is not completely unguided or random or undirected. But then, I mean, to my mind, what exactly is the fundamental difference between saying that God intervened in the world in a kind of robust way by, I don't know, like just creating the flagellum like ex nihilo, like completely from scratch, or creating human consciousness from scratch or whatever, or I mean, you can come up with all sorts of scenarios, something like irreducibly complex systems, or saying that it happened in a much more subtle and covert way by God, just through quantum mechanic effects, ensuring that the right mutations would arise. It's both of it is supernatural intervention. So, what exactly the difference? Why is it legitimate for somebody like Francis Collins to believe that God intervenes in a way that is statistically undetectable and subtle, and it is not okay for somebody like Michael Behe to say that he does so in a slightly different way? I mean, for me, both of it is there is an interaction between the supernatural and the natural realm in their view because of course there is. I mean, if you believe that God cares about us, yeah, of course somehow he's gonna have to intervene in the world. He's gonna be involved with the world somehow. It's just that they have a different understanding of how this happens in the history of life. So even there, I think just the whole, even up until this day, I don't know really if intelligent design is by definition a supernatural hypothesis. I mean, back then there were some people, I think William Dembski and Michael Behe, perhaps somewhat disingenuously, because of course we knew that they were evangelical Christians, and they, for them, of course, it was about the Bible and about God. But they said something like, well, the intelligent designer does not necessarily have to be a supernatural being. I mean, it could be an extraterrestrial thing. It could be like the software designer of the computer simulation that we're living in. And at least, I mean, in the case of extraterrestrials that are not by any stretch supernatural, what is what is there like intrinsically wrong with the idea of intelligent design? I mean, especially if you, I mean, it was from a strategic point of view, it was clever for them to kind of hold open the door for a kind of natural intelligent designer, because that made it more difficult for the you know, the defenders of the scientific orthodoxy to rule out intelligent design from the outset, like without even looking at the evidence. Again, and this harks back to the point that we discussed at the very beginning. None of us really has a very good idea of what the natural amounts to, what it would mean for something to really qualify as supernatural. If some like, okay, aliens on a different planet, but that's probably not supernatural. Okay, they just live in the same universe, so you know, they their bodies, or you know, obey the same physical laws. But what if they're living, I don't know, like in a different dimension? What if this is the Matrix and they're just in a sort of higher plane of existence? Are they supernatural? I don't know. I mean, it depends on your definition of these concepts, and all these concepts are extremely slippery.
Yeah, now that's a really interesting way of putting it. And I love the way that you gave the example of, I mean, where is the real difference between Francis Collins? I mean, one way of putting it is, if you're going to get invaded by a country and your radar detects the planes, or it doesn't. So if you go under the radar, you can't see anything. What is intervening through quantum fluctuations, which is the Francis Collins view, or say the Michael Behe view, where no, it's a B-52, we can see it coming in. It's still supernatural.
It's just, and the bombs are still going to be falling. And so, I mean, of course, bombs are destructive. But when it comes to the bacterial flagellum, for example, on the one hand, somebody like Francis Collins, and I mean, there's another theistic evolutionist that I can't really think of right now. On the one hand, they want to say that, oh no, this is nothing. We're not like interfering in the proper domain of science, because this is all happening at the subatomic level, and it's all very subtle, and you're not going to notice the difference. But then on the other hand, they also want to say that you will notice the difference, because of course the whole point of the intervention is that you make something happen that would not otherwise have occurred, right? If it doesn't make any, like, if it's not statistically detectable, then it doesn't make any difference, and then it will also not make any difference to the evolution of life. It's only when God brings about something that would not otherwise have occurred. And if that's the idea, if God brings about something that counterfactually would not have occurred, then it becomes again statistically detectable. Then you can just look into it and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not according to the laws of statistics. Somebody is like as if you're playing with a roulette wheel, and you say that the roulette wheel is not behaving in accordance to the law of statistics, and you say the roulette wheel is rigged. Somebody has tampered with the equipment. In the same way, you could investigate mutations and see, is there any evidence that that they deviate from the laws of statistics, and if so, I mean, is the supernatural intervention a plausible hypothesis? So they're in a kind of a bind, because on the one hand they want to respect the proper the proper purview of science, and they don't want to interfere, because of course, you know, they have this separation between the two different magisteria. And on the other hand, as religious believers, they want a God that is relevant, that is involved, that makes it different in this world, and that leads them into a sort of unresolved contradiction or conflict, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good way of wrapping up how the entire discussion just comes around. So my last question, I guess, is you're obviously, I mean, can I say you're a naturalist? I mean, you're an atheist, right?
Yeah, I'm an atheist. So sometimes I use the word naturalism, but in a slightly different way. Naturalism in philosophy, I mean, it's there are different schools and approaches to naturalism, of course. But naturalism is also sometimes taken as the opposite of analytical philosophy. So in analytical philosophy, You just analyze concepts, and you look at the logical structure of arguments. And naturalists are people that believe that reason is an embodied cognitive faculty. It is something that evolved, something that is happening in the social context, and they're very much interested in psychology. So naturalism, in that sense, is very similar to Quine's holistic view of philosophy, where basically everything is connected in one web and everything hangs together, and philosophy has to cooperate with other disciplines. So sometimes I use the word naturalism for that, and then of course it doesn't really have to do anything to do with the supernatural. But in the sense that of methodological naturalism, yes, I guess I'm a naturalist, but I would probably say, yeah, that atheism is because it's just a clear description, especially if you're living in a context where in a society where most people believe in some sort of theism, some sort of God, then it's more informative to tell people that, oh, I'm an atheist, so that means that I don't believe in God. But yes, I am also a naturalist in the sense that I have not yet seen any convincing evidence of the supernatural, but I'm always willing to change my mind, and it is not logically impossible for some evidence to ever to ever crop up, and then I would have to change my mind.
Okay, so I wanted to put a quote to you that Roos often in his discussions with Dembski, and I'm sure others, said. I just want your thoughts on it. So what he said was essentially, if he was to believe in design, it would be because he believes in God. It's not that he believes in design, therefore believes in God. So basically, he's quoting somebody, but he often said this. He says, I see design because I believe in God. It's not that I believe in God because of design. I just want your thoughts on this sort of way of phrasing.
That's again a sort of putting the cart before the horse thing again. It's almost as if believing in God is just like, it's just an arbitrary subjective decision that you can make, and some people believe it, some people don't believe it. It's not a matter of evidence, not a matter of rationality, and you can believe whatever you like. And so that is some people's understanding of faith. But I think, in my experience, even people who believe in the, like, taking that leap of faith, and religious believers, they want to have they don't really view it as something that's completely subjective. Of course not. I mean, it doesn't. They need to have some sort of ground. It's not necessarily empirical evidence. It's not that they want to have experienced a miracle for themselves, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a holy book, but something to base their belief on, other than just saying, well, I choose to believe in God. I mean, in my later work, I actually defended the view that it's impossible to choose what to believe. You cannot. I mean, if I put a gun against your head and said, like, I give you $1 million, or I decide not to kill you if you believe that unicorns exist. I mean, you have a very strong incentive to believe that unicorns exist, but you could not bring yourself to believe that, because belief is not under conscious control. There's always, I think, some reason why we believe, and it's not necessarily a good reason. I mean, if you believe something because your parents told you so, I mean, that might not be the best reason. Although, on the other hand, I mean, parents are generally very reliable sources of information and trustworthy authorities on many subjects. So why wouldn't you believe that God exists if your parents tell you so, and if they behave in accordance with their belief? So what do I think of that quote by Roos? Yeah, I would just turn it around. I think the only way for me to believe in God is if I had some sort of evidence, and evidence of design would be that. I mean, it would not be the only kind of evidence that I can imagine. Let me put it differently. I have often wondered if I had lived 200 years ago, before Darwin, and I was just reading somebody like William Paley or many of these other natural theologians, and I was just wondering about the adaptive complexity of the world, and it's something that's like insanely sophisticated and elaborate, and like there's no way, I cannot wrap my mind around it, like how to explain this without, like the watchmaker's analogy, like this is so intricate, this is so sophisticated, that somebody must have designed this. I probably would have been a believer, and I probably would have been a believer. I mean, I'm probably, my main reason for for believing in God would have been something like the argument from adaptive complexity. So again, now I think, because science is always competition between different hypotheses, I think we have a better explanation of adaptive complexity now. But when theism or supernatural belief was the only alternative on offer, I think I would have been a believer. Absolutely.
Interesting. That is really interesting. I mean, this kind of goes back to what Dawkins says, that in The Blind Watchmaker, that Darwin allowed us to be intellectually fulfilled atheists.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that is true. That is true. I mean, there were atheists before, of course, but they didn't really have, satisfactory explanations of a lot of things. I mean, they had some inkling of, some promissory notes about, oh, well, eventually we'll find out. And and of course, there's still unresolved questions in science. So there's always, I mean, people don't really believe that most people no longer believe that adaptive complexity requires supernatural design. But there are still some holdouts, somebody like Francis Collins, for example, who says that human consciousness is something that is miraculous or cannot be explained in any natural way. Other people say that perhaps the origin of life itself, or just the existence of the universe. So there are still some mysteries. But I think, in this context, with the track record of science, at least the strongest argument in favor of a creator has already been dealt with by Darwin. So in that sense, I agree with Dawkins that that was a killer argument for theism before Darwin.
Okay, thank you so much, Maarten, for this really enlightening session. I would love to have you back when you are free. And for anybody who wants to follow Maarten, I mean, I found your Twitter, right? So I can put that in the comments. Is there anywhere else people can follow you and see what you're up to?
I'm on Substack as well. So on Twitter, I mostly tweet in English, sometimes in Dutch. My Substack is only in English, and I plan to write more on Substack. I just published a piece today on mind viruses. The idea that they're also something that actually originated in some way with Dawkins' idea of selfish memes. But in this era of disinformation and conspiracy theories and and fake news, many people have, many scholars have, defended this idea that there are certain ideas that spread and function like viruses, and that spread like from one person to the next. So that's the latest piece that I published on Substack, and I'm working on a book, The Betrayal of Enlightenment, that I'm writing in Dutch first. It's 90% finished. And I will start writing, translating essays and chapters also on my Substack. So there's already one piece that is drawn from the book on my Substack.
That's really good to hear. And then when you were talking about, ideas that spread like wildfire, I was thinking of Trump's, they're eating cats and dogs. That
reached millions of minds. Although not all the people that it reached were persuaded. Of course, it was there were also a lot of useful memes. They read it, and it was I saw some very funny videos as well. So it's interesting. There are many analogies between just biological viruses, biological germs on the one hand, and the way beliefs spread. Also, true beliefs spread like viruses as well. That is, I mean, some true breaking news on CNN, for example, if there's a terrorist attack or a natural disaster, that also spreads like wildfire, or like a virus, of course. But the cats and dogs thing, that's I don't know. There's probably at least the majority of the planet that is aware of this. It is totally bizarre and unfounded accusation.
It was. It's really hilarious. So thank you, Maarten. I really want to bring you back at some point, and I wish you the best in your future endeavors.
Thanks a lot for having me, and see you next time.
Cheers.